Aquila, Chapter 8. Mr. Bamford, the physics teacher, was a short, balding man who usually enjoyed answering children's questions, but preferred not to do it at the end of the school day when he was trying to get back to the staff room and smoke his pipe. However, when Jeff and Tom appeared in front of him holding out a copy of The Sunday Mirror, he stopped to listen. As far as he could remember, neither of the boys had ever spoken to him before, and he was curious to hear what they wanted to say. "We were wondering what a UFO like this would have worked on," said Jeff. Mr. Bamford took the paper and looked at the photograph on the front page. "Worked on? What it would have had in it," said Jeff. "You know, to make it go." "We thought possibly uranium," put in Tom, "or plutonium?" Mr. Bamford studied the blurred image of Aquila for a moment before handing it back to Jeff. "Apart from the fact that this photograph is obviously fake, he set off down the corridor towards the staff room, "I think any scientist would tell you that if there were such things as flying saucers, they would hardly be likely to run on anything as dangerous as radioactive isotopes." He took his pipe out of his pocket as he walked. "An advanced star-traveling technology would be capable of extracting the energy from more basic forms of matter." "Like what?" asked Jeff. "Anything." Mr. Bamford took out a box of matches. "Did you know that theoretically there's enough energy in a sugar lump to supply a city the size of New York with electricity for a week?" "You're saying it runs on sugar lumps?" said Jeff. "I'm saying that if your technology is advanced enough, you could run something like that on any form of matter you chose." Mr. Bamford stopped as he reached the staff room door. "Even the molecules from something as simple and basic as sugar." "You mean it could run on anything?" "Anything at all." Mr. Bamford pushed open the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important staff meeting to attend." It had been a disappointing conversation, Tom thought, as he and Jeff walked back to the domestic science block. If Aquila could be powered by anything, then their chances of finding out what it was were slim, to say the least. Not that it made much difference, he thought. Even if Mr. Bamford had told them exactly what Aquila needed, they would still have had the problem of finding where to put it. Aquila's hull had no visible openings that they had ever found, not so much as a glove compartment. "I've been thinking about that," Jeff said when Tom told him. He paused with one foot on the bottom rung of the fire escape. "And maybe that's what we need to know first, not what the fuel is, but where it goes." He started up the ladder. "I mean, if we found where the fuel tank was and it had a bit of fuel left in it, we could look at what was in there, find out what it is, and maybe get some more of it." There was, Tom admitted, a certain logic to this. "Like if we found the end of a sugar lump, we could go out and buy some more sugar." "Exactly." Jeff clambered off the ladder and disappeared into Aquila. Tom followed him. "But we don't know where the fuel tank is, do we?" Jeff settled himself at the controls and gestured to the row of lights in front of them. "Nope, but I should imagine it's opened by one of these." The plan Jeff outlined was very simple. They would press each of the lights in turn, starting at the top and working their way along the rows from left to right, and each time they pressed a button, they would check to see if any secret doors or flaps opened up on Aquila. Both boys were acutely aware that the last time they had pressed a button, they had started 11 fires. But Jeff suggested that if they took Aquila to some isolated part of countryside, they would at least be unlikely to actually kill anyone. Then they discovered that Aquila would never make it to the open fields. As Jeff flew Aquila away from the side of the domestic science block, he found Aquila's top speed had slowed to little more than a walking pace, and Tom pointed out that there were now 4 of the purple lights flashing from the dash. Instead, they went to the park. It had a hill at one end, the remains of an Iron Age fort, with a hollow in the top that they hoped would not only conceal them from passers-by, but also prevent them doing too much damage if they found anything like that laser beam again. The first 3 buttons Jeff tried produced some interesting results, but none of them seemed to have anything to do with fuel. The first changed the color of the underside of Aquila to a deep blue. For what reason, they never discovered. The second heated the seats, unfortunately to a degree that was a shade more than comfortable. And the third produced a hologram in the air directly in front of them consisting of 2 words. Service sto. The boys had no idea what either of them meant. The results of pressing the fourth button, however, were rather more dramatic. It started with a loud humming sound, and then a thread of blue light appeared from under Aquila. It was not a straight beam as the laser had been, but more like a moving coil that undulated over the grass in front of them, writhing like a snake, and rapidly extending in length as if reaching out for something. Tom found it slightly unnerving and wanted to turn it off, but Jeff was not so sure. "It could be a fuel line," he said hopefully, as the blue light twisted its way up to the lip of the hollow. "Maybe it's looking for fuel, and when it finds some, it'll bring it back." If Tom thought this was unlikely, he also realized that it was no more unlikely than most of the things that had happened since they found Aquila. The truth was that neither of them had ever had much idea what they were doing, until it was too late. Reynolds' newsagent stood at the end of a row of 4 shops, serving a housing estate that had been built on the east side of Staveley in the 70s. When Miss Taylor walked in, both Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds were serving behind the counter, and the shop was busy with customers. Mr. Reynolds, a large, confident, good-looking man, gave her a cheery wave as soon as he saw her, and, ignoring everyone in the queue, came over to ask how he could help. "I wanted a word about Jeff, if you had a moment," said Miss Taylor, "but don't worry if you're busy. I'm quite happy to wait." "Wouldn't hear of it." Mr. Reynolds led Miss Taylor to a door at the back of the shop. "Can't keep a busy woman like you waiting, Miss Taylor. You come on through." Experience had taught him that it was not wise to leave Miss Taylor in the shop for any length of time. In the course of her career, she had taught a good many of his customers, and she had a habit, if given the chance, of telling them not to waste their money on chocolate and reminding them how unhealthy it was to buy cigarettes. He ushered her straight through to the sitting room and pulled up a chair. "So, what troubles he in this time, then? Nothing too serious, I hope?" "It's not really trouble at all," said Miss Taylor. "It's just his behavior recently has been a little odd." "Odd?" "Yes." Miss Taylor hesitated. It was not easy to put what she felt into words. "He's been seen in the library a couple of times, and he's been asking questions in class, wanting to know about things." "Asking questions?" Mr. Reynolds' face furrowed with concern. "Right. I'll have a word with him about that." No, we don't mind," said Miss Taylor. "In fact, it's the sort of thing we encourage. It's just that Jeff's never done it before. It seems to have started on this geography field trip he went on. You haven't noticed anything different about his behavior since then?" Mr. Reynolds thought for a moment, then shook his head. "There's nothing he's done?" Miss Taylor persisted. "Nothing he said or talked about?" Miss Reynolds dug deep in his mind to try and remember anything that Jeff might have talked about in the last week. "I could ask Mrs. Reynolds," he said eventually. "I know she listens to the lad sometimes." Mrs. Murphy was walking home through the park, her shopping trolley loaded with cat food. As she paused to catch her breath at the point where the path circled the crest of the old fort, the sound of a low humming caused her to look up. The noise grew louder, and a moment later a cord of blue light appeared over the edge of the hill, paused for a second as if it were an animal sniffing the air, and then turned towards Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. Murphy backed away, but the light was already moving straight towards her, purposefully humming its way down the side of the hill, gathering speed as it did so. In rising panic, Mrs. Murphy began to run. She moved with remarkable speed for an 83-year-old with bad legs, but she was no match for the light. In a last desperate effort to get away, she abandoned her trolley and then watched in horror as, a second later, the blue light caught it, engulfed it, and began dragging it back up the hill. "My shopping!" Mrs. Murphy called to anyone who could hear. "Help! It's taken my shopping! And my purse! It's stolen my purse!" Sitting in Aquila, Jeff and Tom could not hear Mrs. Murphy's cries, but they watched in fascination as the tip of the blue light reappeared over the brow of the hill, pulling something along with it. "Wow! What is that?" "I'm not sure," said Tom, "but it looks like a shopping trolley." Jeff reached out and turned off the button. The light disappeared, and the trolley fell over sideways on the grass. In the silence, they could hear Mrs. Murphy calling for help, and then a man's voice asking what had happened. "We'd better get out of here," said Tom. "Right." Jeff pulled the sticky tape over the invisibility button and put his hands on the controls. There were several voices now, and they were getting nearer. "Jeff?" Tom wondered what his friend was waiting for. "I think we should go home. I think we should go home now. Go home now." "We can't." A bead of perspiration trickled down Jeff's face. What? We can't. His thumb was pressing the up button as hard as he could. This is it. Full speed. He stood up briefly and then sat down again. And we're not invisible either. As Tom slowly absorbed this information, both boys could hear the voices drawing closer. Several people were scrambling up the other side of the slope, and in a few seconds' time, the men looking for Mrs. Murphy's shopping trolley would come over the hill. They would see the boys and Aquila. They would ask questions. They would want to know. It was finished. The whole adventure was over, and they both knew there was nothing they could do about it. Jeff's hands fell from the controls, and they waited. It was all they could do. As if to express how they felt, it suddenly started to rain. Miss Taylor's conversation had not been as productive as she had hoped. According to Mrs. Reynolds, her son had no new interests, hobbies, or friends, and was behaving in exactly the way he'd always done. He did go out a bit more these days, she admitted, but she had no idea where he went. I'm sorry he's causing you all this bother, Mr. Reynolds said as Miss Taylor finally stood up to leave. But I'll have a word with him. Make sure he keeps out of the library, that sort of thing. Please don't. Miss Taylor sometimes wondered if Jeff's father had fully grasped what children going to school was really about. In fact, I'd rather you didn't mention that I'd been here at all, if that's all right. Anything you say, said Mr. Reynolds cheerfully. As he led Miss Taylor back out to her car, he suddenly remembered something. There is one thing he's got interested in. Yes? Just this last week, too. Mr. Reynolds couldn't imagine why he'd not thought of it before. UFOs. He's got interested in flying saucers. He likes me to check in the morning, see if there's anything about them in the papers. Mr. Reynolds smiled happily. There, I knew there was something. Thank you, said Miss Taylor. It wasn't the sort of information she had expected, but she filed it carefully away in her mind as she put the car into gear and drove off. It might only be a small piece of the jigsaw, but experience had taught her that was always how you arrived at the final picture, one piece at a time. It was Tom who noticed first. It was raining quite hard, one of those sudden heavy showers that can soak you to the skin before you even have time to open the umbrella, but neither of them was getting wet. Nor was Aquila. As Tom looked, he could see the raindrops splashing down towards the hull, but somehow, without ever seeming to connect, Aquila's surface remained perfectly dry, as if the rain was being absorbed before it could land. A man's face appeared over the brow of the hill. It was an elderly figure with a walking stick, which he pointed down the slope. There it is. He started walking towards the shopping trolley on its side on the grass. Another man, a park attendant, scrabbled up the slope to join him. I'll get it. You wait here. He had his coat pulled over his head to keep off the rain, and he climbed down towards the trolley as two more men appeared, half carrying, half dragging a rather bedraggled Mrs. Murphy. This your trolley, missus? Asked the park attendant as he pulled it upright. Mrs. Murphy nodded. Why aren't they looking at us? Said Jeff. Why haven't they said anything? I don't think they can see us. Tom was still looking at the water not landing on Aquila. He had suddenly remembered what Mr. Bamford had said about an advanced technology being able to extract energy from almost anything. He pointed to the purple lights at the center of the dash. Only two of them were flashing now, and as he watched, one of those blinked into stillness. Water. Tom could hardly believe it, even as he said it. It runs on water. That evening in the garage, Tom filled Aquila from a garden hose. It was a strange sight. The water cascaded onto Aquila's hull and disappeared. For almost 2 hours, he ran the tap at full flow, and for almost 2 hours, the water vanished somewhere into Aquila before suddenly splashing off the surface and onto the floor, and Tom hurriedly went to turn off the tap. As the water was running, Tom tried to calculate how much of it Aquila was taking on. He knew the hose could fill a 2-gallon watering can in about half a minute, so in 2 hours, Aquila must have absorbed quite a lot. He thought it might be worth working out exactly how much, as it seemed to be more than there was physically room for it to hold, which would be interesting. Jeff left Tom to look after the water. Sitting in Aquila, he pressed the third button from the left on the top and watched as the hologram of words appeared in the air in front of him. Service sto. Laboriously, he set about copying the words, one letter at a time, onto a piece of paper. He had a strong desire to find out what they meant.